Welcome in, everyone. Let us know where you're chiming in from in the chat.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a minute or so. Well, I just want to thank you for joining and navigating your multi-cloud journey. Elevate is an independent customer-led user group, Dell Technologies customers on multi-cloud journey to modernizing their IT infrastructure. We bring customers, partners, employees together to share best practices and network with the industry experts at virtual and in-person events throughout the year. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please submit them through the Q&A function. Our host today's webcast is Chris Stanley, Vice President, Network Operations at LoopUp and President of the Elevate User Group Board. Chris, I'm going to pass it on over to you to get started with our guest speaker.
Thank you, Gabby, and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Today, we're going to go through a very topical conversation with our guest around multi-cloud. We're all probably on the journey in some shape or form, and we will look to give guidance, advice, maybe best practices on how some people are approaching it, maybe Dell's version of that. And to help us navigate that is the wonderful Mr. Mark Thornton. Mark, I'll pass it over to you if you wanted to give yourself a brief intro, what you do day to day, and then we will go into your presentation, and I will say to the users, please keep your messages coming in the chat. We'll make it very interactive, and Mark's very happy to take your questions throughout. Over to you, Mark.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. So welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Thornton. I'm a global field CTO for Dell. I specialize specifically in multi-cloud architectures, right? So, multi-cloud can mean many things to many folks, right? But, focusing on things such as 3-tier HCI, 2 tiers disaggregated. I will get into what some of those mean, by the way. And really, how do we develop an environment in this multi-cloud world now? And again, I'm going to go through some of this stuff. And how do we operate in a multi-cloud world? Because it's quite different, right, to the way we've managed, developed, and deployed IT for the last 25 years. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to really start with that, what that means in terms of multi-cloud. And then I'm going to round out some of the presentation with some of the solution offerings where, strategically where Dell are going to market, right? And what we're seeing being successful.
Thank you, Mark.
Cool. Chris, are you able to see my screen?
Perfectly, thank you.
Excellent. Is there anything else we want to round out before I jump in?
No, I think that's good. Carry on, and we will interject where needs possible.
Perfect. Just like I always mentioned, right? If you have any questions as we go through this, feel free to put it in Q&A. Chris can jump in and we can get those answered for you. So it is a multi-cloud world. So if we look at IDC, if we look at Gartner, if we look at Forrester, right, what we're seeing is around 93% of organizations globally are doing some form of multi-cloud, right? Whether that be a primary data center with a colo with some edge locations, whether that be a data center interconnected to one of the hyperscalers, or whether it's simply using a primary data center with a disaster recovery and some software as a service, O365, SAP, for example, right? Most organizations are doing this and moving with velocity, I would say, down this road. So as we start to introduce things such as DevOps and more automation within the environment, it really is becoming a multi-cloud operating model. So with multi-cloud, right, it brings up a slew of challenges, right? And I won't drain the slide, but this is actually a marketing slide. And not a big fan of marketing slides, but I do use this because when I'm talking to organizations globally, these same topics come up all the time, right? The risk, governance, how do we retrain internal folks, right? How do we get them understanding VPCs in a hyperscaler? How does that compare to on-prem NSX or Cisco ACI, for example? So there's lots of challenges that come with multi-cloud. And from a Dell strategic approach, we feel we can solve some of these challenges with what we'll call Apex, which I'll get into that a little bit later on. But navigating them can be quite challenging. So why is it challenging? That's really the question, isn't it? So if we take an organization. If we take an organization that has a typical data center and they've got a business unit, maybe several business units that are running cloud native applications, they've got a presence in an AWS, right? They've got a presence in Azure. They're really operating in what you're seeing on the screen here in a bilateral two-estate environment. So to the left side is state number one. It's heavy legacy proprietary workloads. So that can be, a three-tier architecture running database and virtualization, generalized workloads, BDI. It can be HCI, right? It can be, in terms of banking, it can be applications that require low latency connections. So it really is the way we've done IT for the last 20 plus years. And around that, we've built governance, we've leaned on things such as ITIL to develop process and security posture, right, in terms of ACLs, firewalls, and things such as that. Now, when we look to estate number two, and we start looking at placing workloads in a hyperscaler, or I've mentioned hyperscaler a couple of times. Estate number two doesn't have to necessarily be a hyperscaler. If we want to introduce cloud native workloads, even on-prem, we essentially move into estate number two, right? Because resources, they're dynamic, they're fluid. We want to be able to infrastructure as code. Developers want to be able to spin up an environment as they need it, then tear it back down when they're done. And around that, we want to wrap chargeback. We want to wrap things like automation, security, governance, and everything else that comes along with that. So when we break down the estate number one, it's based on traditional business models, traditional business services, right? It's fixed infrastructure for the most part. We'll spin up a project, then through that project, we'll procure hardware, we'll procure an environment, we'll use shared services such as Active Directory, maybe LDAP, some other services that are out there. And we have an island, if you like, of fixed infrastructure that's not fluid and it's not dynamic, which is quite the polar opposite to what we're doing with cloud native workloads, right? So it's a digital business model. It's digital services, it's microservices, and it's a very rapidly continuous improvement, continuous development life cycle, right? So it really is quite different. So I love sharing this slide with organizations, and this slide that I'm going to share with you is really the journey, if you like, of how I typically see organizations getting to a true operating model in multi-cloud. Now, you see I've got journey, a strike through on journey in the top left corner there. And though technically we can call this a journey, when we're talking about true multi-cloud, it's an operating model. It's a way that we conduct IT and we operate in this model. And fundamentally, at the end of the day, we're trying to do one thing, and that's essentially place a workload in the right place at the right time that's going to be the most optimal and it's going to be the most cost effective. right? That's essentially what multi-cloud is. So it becomes an operating model and a decision tree of, where we've got a new application we're going to launch. Is that going to be more cost effective and efficient to run it in a hyperscaler, or is it going to be on-prem? So that's really what it's all about. So if we take a look at this, when someone starts operating in a multi-cloud model and they're on the journey to get there, the ultimate goal is right here. So we want a private cloud, we want a public cloud, and maybe multiple of each, right? We need edge locations, and we want anything as a service. And that's going to give us a streamlined operating model. Now, vast majority of organizations, unless you're an Uber, unless you're a Netflix, that have developed their model, their business model strictly within the cloud, right? Most organizations start here on the left side. So virtualization, heavy virtualization environment, right, with some software as a service. Now, many organizations tend to go cloud first. That could be driven by many factors. It could be driven by a new CTO coming in and saying, I've kind of seen it work over here. Let's go cloud first. It could be driven by because Gartner said it was a good idea, right? There's many reasons I hear of why organizations go cloud first. Now, cloud first, I would say from the conversations that I've had over the last several years, I would say a high percentage, 98% of the time it fails. And the reason it fails is because what we're trying to do, we'll take a legacy application that was designed for monolithic infrastructure, and we try and place that in a hyperscaler, for example, without understanding the true dependencies, the interdependencies, and some of the attributes that come along with that application. So what that does, essentially, it drives up cost. There could be latency issues in there, and it tends to fail. So after an organization goes through that kind of phase, we tend to see this inflection point where the lines of business within the organization are starting to actually spend more on IT than core IT themselves, right? And once we get to that stage, then they have to take a step back and start looking and evaluating what are the business goals, what are the business drivers. And by doing that, that really makes them have to understand workloads, right? What workloads do we have today? What is minimum viable business that we need to operate? And from there, we can do that with a set of principles, right? So, for example, principles would be in your multi-cloud operating model. Principles might be it has to align to our 5-year business plan. What is my exit strategy if I do go into a hyperscaler, or if I choose a software stack, whether that be a Microsoft, a Red Hat, or VMware Broadcom software stack? What is my exit strategy from that, right? And those are the kinds of things that would be considered a guiding principle. In terms of profiling, we look at profiling looking at the application. Is it a tier 1, 2, or 3 application, right? What are its interdependencies with other upstream, downstream systems? Do we have levels of automation wrapped around that, right? Do we have ServiceNow integration? So it's really understanding the application, all the applications at depth. Now, attributes, that's where we want to look at what's the backup strategy for that particular application. The data that the application is using, right? What is the data sovereignty rules, laws, governance around that? So it's understanding the RPO, RTO, and again, really getting to a level of depth. And then lastly, the laws of. So if you're in banking, for example, you need high transaction, low latency connectivity between various applications, right? It's understanding, that level of depth. Now, once we do get to that level of understanding of the applications, what they're all about. And again, most of you likely have some level of understanding already of these applications. But when we get to that point, then we can operate in a true multi-cloud operating environment. And with that, then we can layer it with self-service catalogs. We can layer it with things such as chargeback and internal billing, right? And all of this with common orchestration, common automation, governance, and security. Now, normally when I kind of talk through this, Chris, I love to ask the audience, where do they feel their organization might fall within this kind of flow? Um, is is there anyone in Q&A that wants to speak up and let us know where they think they might fall within this journey?
I'm sure they'll let us know. I know from from the business that I'm in, Mark, I loop up with telecommunications, and we're very much, I'd probably say we're a cloud first business now, but we've come from a legacy business which was very much data center orientated. There is still an element of that, but we are, Azure is our main hyperscaler that we use, but with some AWS, but we're still in that area where that falls on that, where it's what can we move now to the cloud, because the data centers become more expensive. We don't probably need a lot of the old data center requirements that we're used to. We can now terminate in the cloud for like telephony carriers, things like that. So there's more availability, more of all services in the cloud. So we are definitely coming around to sort of cloud first, and that's looking for data centers. Do we restructure? Do we remove X, Y data centers and just have smaller ones? But it's an ongoing process, and we've gone through the pains of, let's put a database in Azure, and it doesn't quite like it, so it comes back on prem. And again, it's a longer term. What do we do with that? But it's sitting on prem and it's currently happy. So we're in the middle of it all, I expect.
It's certainly a learning curve, and though we can have a framework around it, for every organization, every application is different to some extent, right? So it can be interesting.
Yeah, and on prem we use like VxRail, but that is something, again, we don't particularly need on prem, and given costs of support now that's changed, and it pushed us in maybe more in the direction we were going, but it's given us that momentum.
Absolutely, and things such as that, a shift in the industry, like you just mentioned, right? That can cause an inflection point that makes you start to take a step back and look at those guiding principles we mentioned, right? In terms of what is our strategy around making sure we don't get into a situation where we have vendor lock-in, right? So
Yeah,
it can industry changes can drive some of that as well.
very much. There's nothing else in the chat at the moment, Mark, so move on. But if anyone
Sounds good.
wants to come back to us.
So right, once we get to that level of understanding, right, understanding the principles, attributes, profiles, and laws of, then really what that allows us to do is to make those determinations, educated determinations on the 5 R's, right? Do we retire this application? Do we retain it? Do we rehost, migrate? And do we re-platform, rebuild, refactor kind of thing? And a couple of the things you mentioned in there, Chris, really falls into some of this, right? So it really, just by understanding it, it helps us get a better understanding of what we can and cannot do. Now, in terms of multi-cloud, there is really 3 ways that we can operate in a multi-cloud environment, right? So the first is all in public cloud, and just by Chris's example, it can be a challenge, and often it likely will find it doesn't work. Now, then where I find many organizations operating, right, is with the multi-cloud. So you've got the state 1 on the left side, you've got the state 2, you've got network connectivity between your data center, between the hyperscaler, You may have direct connect, express route, right, depending on what your architecture might be. But there are limitations. You may have limitations that your data cannot reside in the hyperscaler for sovereign reasons, right? There may,
Regulatory,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
There may be challenges between latency. So the native applications running in a hyperscaler need connectivity back to the on-prem workloads, but because of that latency, it's a challenge. Then we have sovereign adjacency. So this is where essentially we have the hyperscalers, then we have a colo, and Equinix I'll use as an example. And that is where you have a cage within a colo, and your equipment resides in the cage, yet you're still within the same four walls as the hyperscaler. So using this as an example, right? This is a Equinix data center. You may have a couple of cages in there. You've got your Azures, your IBMs, your Oracles, right, all within the same four walls. So at that point, you have the ability to operate in an environment with a low latency connection to the hyperscaler. Now, within your cage, you can still own the equipment that's in there. The data can still reside within that cage, but you have the ability to take advantage of some of these hyperscaler services, which you might not otherwise in that middle example of a true multi-cloud environment. So I've kind of touched on this already, so I won't spend a ton of time, but at the end of the day, we want cost optimization. It's about productivity, digital resilience, and accelerating the business. And that's why organizations move to a multi-cloud operating model. But just as mentioned, if the application wasn't designed to operate in the public cloud, then you are going to experience performance and latency issues, which will lead to cost and unpredictable workload, right? So it can be a challenge. Now, Dell's strategy around and go to market around multi-cloud is what we call Apex. So Apex is about delivering our offerings in an as a service model, right? And the goal really, we've been doing this for probably about, I'll say 6 years now, in various forms. And essentially it's about delivering infrastructure, but with the flexibility that you get within a hyperscaler. So this is a high level slide, but to the left side, we have a term we call ground to cloud. And what that means is we're taking the best of breed of what we do, and we're putting it in the hyperscaler to give you that experience if you're operating in the hyperscaler. And then we have cloud to ground, right? And it's bringing that same experience that you have in the hyperscaler, but on-prem or in a colo. So what I mean by that is, for example, in operating in Azure, you can spin up a service, spin down the service, and you'll build for what you consume, essentially. With the Apex operating model, we can layer a cluster of servers on the data center floor and storage capacity, and you're essentially just build for what you're consuming. And you can tier up, you can tier down, and it really gives you that similar operating model as to what you would have in the hyperscaler. Are there any questions in chat, Chris?
There's not, no. I mean, from my point of view, for services that I was looking at, I mean, as you're offering for on-prem, what we're calling this day an Apex for Azure is,
Yep.
or what the latest name is. That seemed like the perfect offering on, as a business where we go with, we're a Microsoft partner, and we have a big Azure presence, but there's always a need, as stated before, to have something on premise, and I suppose for people to feel like they still have a bit of control over cost. And I think I know that other businesses I worked for in the past, that was always a big, it's become less over time, but it was always, if we put in the cloud, we're stuck in the cloud and the price could do anything. So it's nice that Dell now have some options, in the Apex range that I think can help facilitate both environments.
Absolutely, and that's really what Apex is about. It is about consistency and it's about predictability, right? Which can be can be difficult in a hyperscaler.
Yeah, I mean, you can get your calculator, or if your cloud, it's going to tell you what it is now, but things can change, and that may scale up quickly depending on how you move as a business, and you might not, you don't always know what is where. So it's yeah, nice for me to have some control anyway. I think it's on this side.
Absolutely. So I want to have basically introduce multi-cloud, the idea of it being an operating model, right? And kind of the way we approach it. Now, there's a couple of solutions that we have in the portfolio which really lean into multi-cloud by design, right? And we're kind of going to go through those here in a second. But before I do, I just want to level set and mention a couple of things here. So if you look to the left side here, we've got a traditional three-tier architecture. So we've got compute, we've got RAM, we've got HBAs, we've got network connectivity going back to a fiber channel switching environment to a storage array. Three-tier, we've been doing that for many years. Many organizations I work with are still operating to some extent in that model. Probably about 9 years ago-ish, 10 years, we started to see that shift to hyperconverged, right? Where we had compute, RAM, storage in a box, and it was highly automated, very simple, single click upgrades, almost an easy button, right? Very, very simple. And in terms of flexibility, it was a little more rigid than a three-tier because three-tier was extremely flexible. But in terms of deployment, management, operation, lifecycle management, that tended to be a little more challenging. Now, with hyperconverged, the challenge that we have is it's linear scaling. So if we need to add additional capacity from a storage aspect, we had no choice but to add CPU and also add additional RAM, right? So it wasn't as flexible as a three-tier system. Now, to the right, says composable there, but this is really what we call two-tier disaggregated architecture. And a two-tier disaggregated architecture is where we have compute and RAM in, for lack of a better word, compute-only nodes. And then we have independent storage, which operates obviously independently. So we can scale storage, we can scale compute and RAM without having that linear scaling model. And in the third example here, it is flexible, it's simple. It becomes a shared resource pool, allowing you to deploy workloads, take workloads down, and put it back into the pool, essentially. We wrap around that security, robust APIs, and AI Ops, which is our software as a service monitoring and deployment tool. So the reason I wanted to level set with this is simply because the solutions I'm going to mention here is majority of them will fall into that composable space. We are seeing a shift in the industry of organizations moving to more of that composable two-tier architecture and less so towards the hyperconverged. Because typically when we go down a hyperconverged stack where we are locked into a particular vendor, where the composable side, it gives us some more flexibility.
We have a question mark.
Of course.
Thank you, Jeff. It's from Adita. I hope I said that right. We are seeing still customers are struggling with legacy apps and costs on moving to cloud. Do you see any benefits coming through for AI on adoption or cloud for cost reduction?
So quite honestly, I think we're still trying to navigate, the organizations are still trying to navigate what AI can bring to the table, right? We know it's going to drive efficiency, and we definitely can see that, but trying to put that into a more pragmatic, practical approach, I think people are still in the early learning stages, right? Because we have many models already. We've got the large language models, and it's a case of finding a use case. For example, I was speaking to an organization recently, and they were insistent they wanted to do AI, and we kind of took a step back, got on the whiteboard, and started to ask the question of, what kind of use cases are we looking at? And the answer was, we're not sure yet. So it's have a build it
I've heard a
and they
word.
will come kind of approach. What was the other side of that question, Chris, aside from the AI?
Did you see benefits in cost coming through AI on or adoption on or cloud or cost reduction?
So in terms of cost reduction within the cloud, absolutely, right. So we're always going to have a need for some form of on-prem infrastructure when we are operating in that legacy estate number one versus DevOps estate number two. There's always going to be that need. Now, I mentioned it up front about it is an operating model, and that operating model is about making sure you put the right workload where it's going to be the most cost effective and operate efficiently, right? So there are going to be many applications that we have that can actually they can run in the hyperscaler, and it likely is going to be cheaper than it is to stand up a singular environment just for that application, right? So there is definitely cost efficiencies, but it's about understanding the application to make sure that we put it in the right place.
Thank you, Mark.
Of course. So they'll have a very robust HCI. I will call it HCI, but HCI / two-tier disaggregator, right? We have a very robust portfolio. Chris mentioned the Apex Azure, right? And I'll chat about that in a second. But we really have these core stacks. So we have VxRail, which Chris also mentioned, which is fully automated, fully lifecycle HCI stack, which is purely based on a VMware Broadcom stack. We have PowerFlex, which I'll get into that in a second, in a bit more depth. But it can be operated in HCI, it can be operated in two-tier disaggregated. We can support Nutanix, we have native edge, and then we have engineered solutions such as Red Hat OpenShift and also Microsoft Azure or Azure Local, right, under the Apex umbrella. So if I start with VxRail, it's been around for about 8 years. It can be architected at the edge. It can be architected in the data center. It is a two-tier disaggregated architecture. We call it dynamic nodes. So you can connect basically a external power store to that. You can connect PowerFlex back to that as well. And when you do that, you don't need vSAN, right? You don't need disks in your nodes. So it can be truly a true two-tier disaggregated architecture, single click upgrades for lifecycle management, and very, very straightforward. So I mentioned PowerFlex. So PowerFlex is unique in that we can practically run any operating system on top of PowerFlex. So we have the concept of compute-only nodes. We have the concept of storage-only nodes. Now, PowerFlex is based on a software-defined storage product that came out of the Scale IO product we had many years ago. And it's high performance, it's low latency software-defined storage. On top of PowerFlex, we can run bare metal, we can run virtual machines, containers, right? And we see it in a lot of banking, right, with trading, and it has extreme scale. So if we take a vSAN cluster, for example, we can scale to 64 nodes. In a PowerFlex cluster, we know that we can scale well above 1,000 nodes, and that's just a theoretical max, right? We know we can go further because the way PowerFlex operates is the more nodes we add, essentially the more I/O we're getting and throughput, right? So it becomes more performant. Now, PowerFlex is pretty unique because it's a software-defined storage offering. We can obviously layer it on our hardware, the PowerEdge hardware, but we also have this deployed into the AWS, Azure, and GCP marketplace. Now, what that does, it brings a unique example to the table, right? So we have our on-prem architecture here on the left side. You've got your compute nodes, they're connecting back to your storage nodes down here in a two-tier disaggregated architecture. It's all going across IP, by the way. There is no fiber channel networking in the two-tier, it's all IP based. Now, PowerFlex has native replication. So whether you're natively replicating between two data centers or into a hyperscaler. So using the Azure Marketplace, you can deploy the PowerFlex storage. We call it Apex block storage, and you can have native replication to the hyperscaler. And it is asynchronous, right? You can replicate back and forth. And this slide isn't depicting it, but you can also replicate to AWS. And you can also replicate between Azure and AWS. So really what that's doing, it's giving you a universal storage layer where you have data mobility between hyperscalers and between on-prem. This next example is really more focused toward Azure and Azure Local. So if we was to deploy Azure Local or even Hyper-V over here, you're going to be running virtual desktops connecting back to this unified storage layer down here, and you're writing your VHDX disks to that universal storage layer. Those disks can be simply replicated, well, the volumes would simply be replicated, and AVD could access those disks, right? And they can also be brought back, and again, they can also be replicated to other data centers. When we have that software-defined storage deployed into the hyperscalers, we can have various availability zones. So you can have replication between availability zones, and you can even have replication between regions, right? So it really begins to open up the idea of data mobility. And when you start looking at the guiding principle I mentioned, such as vendor lock-in, right? It's really, if you go down the Azure path initially, this has given you that universal storage layer to where if you do decide to go down the AWS path a little later, then you have an exit ramp, right? You have an off ramp to be able to do that. Is there any questions in chat, Chris?
Nothing yet, Mark.
All right.
It is true multi-cloud as with all as you say. But it's yeah,
Absolutely.
and I think that again, from a consumer's point of view, it's and when people decide on what to use as a cloud partner, I think it's a brilliant solution, if we should call it that. You have the option. Actually, I don't want to be in this hyperscaler because in this one I get different functionality and I can shift my load to there, so to speak. So it's no, very good.
It really does open things up. And if you put this in the context of implementing this in an Equinix data center, for example, like we talked about, you've got low latency connections and high bandwidth between the hyperscalers and between your cage, right? So it really opens up some interesting solutioning ideas.
Yeah, and I think given the amount of technology, how quick it's coming, companies can make decisions to go, oh, well, we're going cloud first, and this is our part, and this is what we're going to do. But things can shift, and as we've seen, with other things, I won't keep harping on about it. But that vendor lock-in per se, that it gives it more flexibility and maybe people more comfort to move into a cloud environments as well if they're not already.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I also mentioned Nutanix. So if you decide to go down the Nutanix software stack. We can deploy that on our XC nodes. We can deploy it with XC nodes, including licensing, and we can also put that on the PowerFlex platform as well, right? So there's various ways we can deploy that. Now, I mentioned Native Edge. So Native Edge is a solution we came up with a couple of years ago, and it's essentially a zero touch, zero trust, multi-cloud orchestrated solution, right? So where we see this is obviously in edge locations, but we deploy it to the edge. It's fully life cycled, deployable centrally from the data center. And again, it's zero trust, right? And it's a hands-off approach. And on top of this, you can run containers, you can run your virtual machines. So if you've got some edge processing that needs to happen, right, this could be an ideal solution, especially if we're starting to look at doing this at scale across manufacturing sites and even retail, for example.
Mark, we do have a question, probably more for the previous slide though, from Lou.
Of course.
And this might be more of an advice or maybe your view on it, but how do you propose to handle the egress costs as you move your data from one cloud provider to another? Is there, is there any advice or view you have on that?
That is a great question, right? So in terms of having this constantly replicating, that is just not a good idea, right? Because you are going to have these costs. So implementing an architecture in terms of having this universal storage layer, it would be something that I would suggest that you use when you need it, right? So if you are looking to exit ramp off of AWS to Azure or vice versa, or if you are looking to do a migration into the hyperscaler or out of the hyperscaler, that's where this solution is ideal, right? Because it can be configured. It can be configured, turned on, enabled, but replication isn't happening. And so just to give you an example there, we have this set up in our customer solutions center where we have the on-prem environment, it's running, we've got workloads on there, we've got an environment in the hyperscaler in both Azure and AWS, and they have workloads and they are running independently. Now, when I demo this, we enable the connection and we enable the replication, right? Otherwise, you're going to have that constant cost. So it's one of those things that you put in place, you build around it, and then it's there for when you need it.
Thank you, Mark. Good question, Lou. Thank you.
Of course. All right. So Chris mentioned this. So Apex from Azure. So we come to market with what we call Apex Cloud Platforms, and essentially what these are is they are jointly engineered systems with Microsoft and with Red Hat. Now, within this ecosystem, for those of you familiar with VxRail, I mentioned it's the VMware Broadcom stack, full lifecycle management, single-click upgrades, and again, jointly engineered with Broadcom. We did the exact same thing. We took the IP from VxRail, we made it agnostic, and we've engineered that with Microsoft, and we've also engineered that with Red Hat. Now, the concept of cloud platforms is that we have power edge servers, essentially, standardized hardware to begin with. We then use enterprise software defined storage. And that enterprise software defined storage is PowerFlex, which is what we just discussed, and having that ability to have that universal storage layer. And then lastly, what we did, we wrapped management and orchestration around all of that. Now, by doing so, what that gives us is this end-to-end stack. So you could be running Azure Local. You could have a small presence of storage space as direct, connecting that to PowerFlex, which has the ability to replicate into Azure, right? So it's giving you that full end-to-end solution. Now, in terms of Azure, we can use Azure Arc. So if you've got some workloads in Azure already, you may be using Azure Arc, or you are using Azure Arc to manage that workload and policies and everything else. Azure Arc also extends into Azure Local. So you've got that single pane of glass for your on-prem infrastructure of Azure Local, but also your Azure public workloads, right? And giving you underneath all that, you've got that universal software-defined storage layer. So this slide is really just is a matrix, essentially. It's showing you that the solutions that we have, whether it be VxRail, Native Edge, Nutanix, the cloud platforms, it can be delivered in a hyperconverged flavor, or it can be delivered in a two-tier disaggregated flavor as well, right? Now, in terms of the two-tier, this down here is showing you that with VMware, we can connect that to PowerStore and PowerFlex. Native Edge can connect back to PowerStore and so on, right? And in terms of the Red Hat, Microsoft, Nutanix, and VMware stacks, they are all jointly engineered with thousands of hours annually, right? With testing, deployment, engineering, with all of these software vendors. So basically our approach and go to market is we want to be software vendor agnostic, but we also want to make sure that we're jointly engineering with them to provide those solutions.
And Mark, just a question from me: how did Dell see the adoption of these products going now? I mean, they haven't been there that long, but it seems like the perfect solution for a lot of businesses now on an option on where to go with the cloud on-prem. Just wondering what the what the traction is like, what you're seeing.
Absolutely. So over the last couple of years, we've seen, obviously, we have a significant segment with VxRail. And over the last couple of years, we've really seen an uptick in the two-tier architecture with dynamic nodes. So adding PowerStore and adding PowerFlex to the back end to give various tiers of storage and also that flexibility. We're starting to see a ton of traction with Native Edge. And since the Broadcom acquisition of VMware, we are really seeing the uptick with Nutanix, right? And also with Azure Local and OpenShift as well. So we are really seeing those solutions there to the right side really start to take off.
I can imagine. Thank you, Mark.
Of course. All right, so I'll round it out with this. This is just more of a high level of Apex, right? And what the way Apex can be delivered. So here to the left side, it's multi-cloud block and file storage. And from a subscription perspective, everything that we've discussed today, it can be, instead of being delivered as a traditional CapEx purchase like you might, it can be delivered in a subscription. They can range from 1 to 5 years, and they can be extended. We can put, let's say, for example, we put 8 nodes of PowerFlex on the data center floor. If your commitment can only be to 6 of those nodes, so you're committed to 6, but you've got the ability to burst into 30% additional when you need it. Around all that, we wrap services and things such as lifecycle management. All of that is taken care of, right, when you go down the Apex route. And again, it can be delivered on-prem at a partner location or in a colo. And then lastly, we've got the cloud platforms, and we kind of just went over those. So that's really all I had for you today, Chris.
That was very informative. Thank you, Mark. There is Anthony has just posted in there. I think it's back a couple of slides, but he says, why not include non-VxRail vSAN ready nodes on there?
So in terms of why that wasn't included. If I jump back here, so the reason we didn't include vSAN ready nodes in here, definitely an option. Just like with Microsoft, we have AX nodes you can buy, which is the equivalent of a vSAN ready node. But the reason it's not included here is simply because these are engineered systems, right? They're jointly engineered.
Thank you, Anthony, for your question. Thank you, Mark. That was really good, really informative. Thank you, especially for myself. Thank you for your time. I'll pass back to Gabby, who will close us out. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you
Cool.
so much, Mark. That was a great conversation today. And thank you to our sponsors, Dell and Intel. And don't forget to share your thoughts with us and take our survey, which is in the chat, which will also be sent out after the call. And just don't miss out on Elevate at .next on May 7th for our first ever reception in Washington, D.C. And later that month, we will be at Red Hat Summit and join the Elevate user group community on May 20th for a reception at our annual meeting at DTW. Our next webcast will be held on April 17th, so we hope to see you there. And on behalf of the Elevate User Board of Directors, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Artie. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Cheers.